This is a 2006 Cadillac STS-V, and it's an American performance luxury sedan that was meant to rival the BMW M5 and the Mercedes AMG E-Class. This car wasn't made for long, and most people have forgotten about it, but it had a supercharged V8, Brembo brakes, sport suspension, and a lot of other upgrades over a typical boring Cadillac sedan. Today, I'm going to review this STS-V and show you all of its quirks and features. Before I get started, good news, this STS-V is currently for sale and it's being auctioned live on Cars and Bids. These were special cars with big power, and this one is offered with no reserve. So once you finish watching this video, click the link in the description below to visit the live auction for this STS-V, where you can bid on it and buy it only on Cars and Bids. All right, time for the quirks and features of the Cadillac STS-V, starting with the basics. For those of you who don't know that much about this car, which from what I've gathered is a lot of people. So, some background. In the late 90s and into the 2000s, BMW and Mercedes-Benz engaged in a horsepower arms race for their mid-size performance luxury sedan. Mercedes-Benz in the late 90s, the E55 had 350 horsepower. Then the M5 came out, the E39, with 400 horsepower. Then the next E55 came out with 469 horsepower. Then in 06, BMW shows up with a V10 and 500 horsepower. In just 7 years, the power numbers went up by 50% with these cars, and Cadillac wanted in. At this time, Cadillac was trying to shed their image of old people cars for old people. They wanted to be sportier, younger, hipper, more exciting, and so they changed their entire design language and they started rolling out the V cars. Now, everybody knows about the CTS-V, which was intended to fight the BMW M3 and the AMG Mercedes C-Class, but they also went after the E55 AMG and the M5 with this, the STS-V. Now, the STS-V was the high-performance version of Cadillac's midsize STS sedan. The V came out for the 2006 model year, and it had a lot of upgrades over the regular STS, but the biggest was the powertrain. The regular STS only went up to 320 horsepower, but the V had a supercharged Northstar V8 with 470 horses, which placed it squarely in competition with the 469 horsepower E55 AMG and the 500 horsepower BMW M5 that were also on sale back in 06. Now, this supercharged Northstar V8 also had 440 pound-feet of torque, and you gotta admit that even though it's all covered up in this engine bay, it looks pretty cool in there. The Cadillac logo, the V logo, it looks muscly and performancy, and it really was. In fact, Cadillac also beefed up the engine internals in this powertrain in order to handle all the extra power that the STS-V had. And there were many more upgrades as well. One of them you can clearly see under the hood, this strut tower brace for added chassis stiffness to make this car handle a little bit better and maybe feel a little more European on the road. You also had, under the hood, this little badge that let you know this came from GM Performance, and that meant they were serious. A tiny little badge not visible to most people, but when you pop the hood at car shows, people would see that and they'd shake with fear. Obviously, I'm joking, but this car also had some other serious upgrades, one of which was the hood had to be raised up in order to accommodate this larger engine, and so it had kind of a power dome hood. This was sort of a muscle car feature, but because this was a luxury sedan, they didn't accentuate it too much, like paint it a different color or whatever. Still, it had it, and it looked kind of cool if you knew what you were looking for. Now, beyond that, this car also had upgraded brakes. In fact, it had Brembos for improved stopping power. It also had improved sports suspension for a better road feel. Obviously sacrifice a little comfort, but you get a tighter driving experience. And going along with that, there was an improved steering ratio for quicker feeling steering when you were turning. All the upgrades to make it a more performance-y sedan. And the STS-V also had some cosmetic upgrades that were typical of performance luxury sedans at this time. For instance, it had distinctive wheels compared to the regular STS. They're not huge by modern standards, but they did have a different, sportier look that helped this car stand out. Up front, you had a more aggressive front end with a lower bumper and a larger air dam, and you had wire mesh on the grille and on the lower grille, which was supposed to signal this car's performance intent, especially combined with that lower, more aggressive front bumper compared to the standard STS. Now, around back, you had a little rear spoiler you can see mounted on the trunk lid, which gave it a little bit of a performance look, and you had a more aggressive rear end, sort of a lower design below the rear bumper, again to kind of telegraph this car's performance capabilities. In back, you also had dual exhaust, which was a performance car type feature, although it's not particularly burbly or exciting a sound. This was intended to be a luxury car first and a performance car second, and so, well, it's not that crazy, but take a listen. Now, in addition to that, you had a few V badges on the outside of this car, again to signal that this was the special version of the STS. You have one on the trunk lid, and you have more on the front doors, although those are also coupled with the word supercharged spelled out on both front doors to really indicate that this was a special car, at least if you knew to look there to see that this wasn't your regular, ordinary Cadillac STS. But beyond all the V upgrades to this car, there are a few other exterior quirks worth pointing out, starting with the overall design, which I actually always loved about this car. It was Cadillac's attempt to sharpen up, to go younger, and so the design language had more creases and angles as opposed to soft curves like earlier Cadillac models. The earlier version of this car, which was called the Cadillac Seville, had a very soft, flowy design that really had an appeal to elderly people and few others. But in this car, Cadillac tightened things up. They sharpened it. You had right angles and sharper edges that really did kind of help the car look a little bit younger, a little bit hipper, a little bit more spry, just like the buyers they were attempting to get by adopting this design language. And one of the cool changes they made to this STS was adding LED lighting in back. You had LED taillights, LED brake lights, and LED turn signals, which don't sound like a big deal now, but they were huge when this car came out back in 2004. Not too many vehicles had adopted LED lighting, but this had, and again, it made it seem more exciting and fresh and modern than an old school halogen bulb. The drawback, however, was always this car's size. Even though the STS was smaller than its predecessor, the Seville, it was still big by mid-size luxury car standards. The BMW 5 Series, the Mercedes E-Class from this era were both around 190 inches long, more or less, but this car was 197. It doesn't sound like a huge difference, just 7 inches, but the car was always bigger than its European rivals, and that, of course, had an effect on the dynamics because those extra 7 inches also came with extra weight and extra heft that you had to move around, especially a drawback for the performance model. Now, with that said, the E55 and the BMW M5 from 2006 both had a starting price between $82,000 and $85,000, whereas the STS-V's starting price was $77,000. So Cadillac, at least on paper, had an edge. Similar power, but less money and a larger car with a larger interior. It had some appeal to a lot of people, but at the same time, it kind of lost the plot for a sporty sedan. Larger wasn't necessarily necessarily what you wanted. Even if it meant more interior room, it also meant usually worse driving dynamics, even if it was powerful and less expensive. And the Cadillac's lower price point compared to its rivals was particularly reflected in the interior, which is just not up to par in terms of quality, design, and materials compared to Audi, BMW, Mercedes-Benz, the other top luxury brands from this era. You can see there's a lot of plastic in this interior, doesn't really look all that great, and the design is not particularly exciting or breakthrough. It's just sort of plain and simple, not necessarily what you'd expect if you were spending $80,000 on a performance luxury sedan. It's worth pointing out that BMW and Mercedes, this wasn't their finest era of interiors either, but the Cadillac lagged even behind mid-2000s BMW and Mercedes, which really isn't saying much for the quality of this cabin. Now, another thing to point out in here is that by modern standards, this infotainment system is really laughable. The home screen is right here. It displays what appears at first glance to be an analog clock, but it has no clock hands, and instead it displays the time digitally in the middle of what turns out to be a fake clock. And that is just the beginning of the ridiculousness of this infotainment. Unfortunately, it is a touchscreen and it does incorporate radio controls. And it works reasonably intuitively, but it's slow, it's pixelated, it does not look good, and you gotta use it in order to access the sound system in this car. Really not the highest quality system in here, but at the time it was relatively acceptable, particularly compared to BMW's confounding iDrive. At least Cadillac had a touchscreen. Now, although the infotainment system does include the audio controls, thankfully it does not integrate the climate controls, which you can see are here in the center control stack near the bottom. And actually, I really like how these climate controls operate, specifically for the passenger side. So you have dual zone climate control, driver and passenger, and when the passenger wants to change their temperature, you just press this second climate temperature button over on the passenger side. That turns the passenger temperature on, and then you adjust the dial and turn it to what temperature you want. And when you want to sync driver and passenger side again, there's no sync button. Instead, you just turn off the passenger side. It's actually a very simple and yet very easy solution to a dual zone climate control setup with different temperatures, and I don't know why more automakers don't adopt something this simple. Now, one unusual thing about the climate control is the heated seat control is here too, and you can see it has up and down arrows, and that changes the amount of heating. Up for more heat, down for less, and the heated seat actually appears in this little screen above the climate controls to let you know if it's on or off and how much heated seat you have selected. Kind of an unusual thing compared to a button that just lights up, but that's what they've done. And speaking of screens in this car, you have another one in the gauge cluster. You have your typical analog gauges in here, but mounted directly below that, you have this pixelated screen that shows your odometer reading, your typical stuff, but also it can be adjusted to show a wide variety of vehicle information. And it really is a wide variety. It can show your tire pressure in all 4 tires. You can go tire by tire to see it. It'll show your current fuel range, your instant fuel economy, your overall fuel economy, gallons of fuel that you've used. It'll even show the current speed that you're going, so you don't have to try to look at the analog gauge cluster and figure it out. That's pretty cool. Amazingly, this screen even has a boost gauge, so you can monitor your boost when you're really spooling up that supercharger and getting going on it hard. That'll show in real time, which is also pretty cool. But other interesting quirks and features in here, there are quite a few. You open up this center armrest, the center console, and you can see ports for red, yellow, and white in case you want to plug in an Xbox or a DVD player inside your STS. I guess that would have been for rear seat entertainment. If you wanted to have some accessory solution, you had the plugs in here, so you could plug it in and set it up for rear passengers. Also interesting in this vicinity, you go to the seat backs and you can see speakers have actually been integrated into the seat back next to the headrest. You have one on the right and one on the left to maximize your sound quality, and that's on the driver and passenger side, which was a pretty neat idea. These days, a lot of cars have speakers integrated into the headrest. You didn't see that too much 20 years ago when this car was being sold, but you can see where they were going with it, and they were kind of ahead of their time. The seats themselves are also worth pointing out. You have an Alcantara seat center, which would have been a classy touch back in 2006 when this car was new, but the seats are not sport seats by any stretch of the imagination. They are not particularly heavily bolstered to keep you in place around hard corners. This was a sport sedan, but also a Cadillac, and so you got a nice leather overstuffed comfortable seat instead of some sports seat that would hug you and keep you in place when you were going fast. Other interesting items in this car: open up the glove box and you can see on the inside this little panel, this velvet panel, is a business card holder. You have a velvet business card holder in your STS-V glove box for all the very important business people that you would meet. Of course you would. You were driving a Cadillac STS. Also interesting in this car, borrowed from the C6 Chevy Corvette, is an unusual starter button. You can see it here. If you press it up, it starts the car, turns on the engine so you can drive off. If you press it down, it turns the car off. So it's not just an on-off button, it actually is a switch that can be pressed up or down and has different functions depending. And a second press down will turn on accessories, but not quite turn on the engine, which can only be done with the press up. This is interesting and unusual, but it was the early days of start-stop buttons. Most cars from this era, even luxury cars, still had a physical key, so this was a pretty neat feature that was ahead of its time. And another one was electronic door openers. This car doesn't have the mechanical door openers up front. When you open the door handle, you can hear a little electronic release, and then it opens, which I guess reduces the amount of force you have to use to open the door. It was kind of a gimmick, but it's what they did to add luxury to the luxury STS. Interestingly though, that feature was removed from the back doors. You can see up front the electronic door lock. In back you have a regular physical manual door lock and mechanical door opening. They only put it in front. I guess that's a victim of cost cutting. But despite that cost cutting, the rest of the back seat was a pretty nice place to hang out and spend time. For one thing, you had the same Alcantara seat centers in back that you had up front, and leather everywhere else, which was a nice touch and made the back seats look pretty good. You also had some surprisingly luxurious features back here. You have a rear seat climate control, which I'm shocked to see in a car like this from this era, but you can change the temperature and the placement of the air, and you have climate vents, as you can see back here, for the rear passengers, which is a pretty nice feature. And as you can see, there's also heated rear seats back here, which is another nice luxury touch that you didn't get that frequently back in this era, even on some high-end rival cars. Also worth pointing out in the back, it's pretty nice back here. It's reasonably roomy. You got decent space for your knees, for your head, your hips, etc. Not huge in back, but there's definitely enough room for adults to sit up front and adults to sit in back, all comfortably. And I guess that was the main reason that Cadillac wanted to make the car a little longer than its European rivals. They wanted that interior space. They wanted to be able to say, hey, we make this big car with this big interior, which was important to American buyers. You lost a little in terms of size and weight and dynamics, but you gained interior space. And the same was true in the trunk. You open up the trunk, you can see it's reasonably large. There's good space in there for your golf clubs or whatever else Americans want to carry around with them. You had decent trunk space, decent interior space. It came at the expense of the overall size, but those were some benefits that undoubtedly helped some buyers choose this over the smaller European performance luxury rivals. Anyway, with that in mind, let's see how it drives. So curious to see how a 20-year-old Cadillac meant to rival AMG and BMW M actually feels on the road. So let's get behind the wheel and find out. All right, driving the STS-V, the forgotten V car. Everybody knows the CTS-V, of course CT5, CT4. The XLR-V gets some love, the Escalade. People forget this car existed, but it did exist, and it was actually pretty legit on paper. 450 horses, 470 horse, whatever it is. I mean, that's a pretty strong number for a mid-size-ish, largish sedan, especially back in this car's era. It's got good power. And I always thought it looked nice, the sort of sharper angles, and this is when Cadillac was really going all out to appeal to kind of a younger, sportier, hipper audience, and a big sedan like the STS wasn't really the car for that, but they couldn't completely abandon the STS, but they could make it sharper and cooler and tighter and offer a performance model. So first thing you notice when you get in this car is two things really. just driving for a couple of minutes, you can tell that from a powertrain perspective, it's going to be pretty meaty. This is a good engine. The Northstar was a good motor. It had issues in the early years, but by the time this car came out, those issues were largely resolved. But then you throw a supercharger on it, and you get to the power level this car has, and even just like short bursts away from a stop sign, I can tell with a little bit of throttle that there's a lot of torque, there's a lot of good smooth torque, and there's got a lot to give. And I'll get it to a better road in a sec where I can open it up a little bit more. But the other thing that you can tell is that dynamically this car is just not going to be on the level of a BMW M5 from this period. It's larger, the steering is more assisted, the suspension is simply not as tight as much of sport suspension. They just didn't want to go that far with this car. They took it pretty far for what it is and for Cadillac and for this era, but they just didn't want to go all that way. So you go into a corner and you try to throw around the corner, well, you have this like pretty heavily assisted steering, pretty much body roll, and you don't have an enormous amount of great steering feel in the front, or even really all that fantastic handling. Actually, the body roll is relatively composed. It's really more of an issue of steering, which just does not feel particularly strong. But you do floor it, and this car can go. This car has serious power and performance potential. It can absolutely go. Even by modern standards, this feels like a fast car. That trans kicks down a couple of gears and it rockets. I know, I mean, it's not, it's not a Model S Plaid in terms of acceleration, but going in knowing what this car was and where it competed, you can understand why Cadillac thought they had a pretty decent rival in their minds to cars like the AMG, E-Class and things like that. Like they had delivered the power and the acceleration, and in a pretty subtle package. Now this is cool because I'm going up a hill here, and it's a pretty steep hill, but even with mid throttle, this car is accelerating hard and just goes. It's not necessarily a smooth transmission, but it does the job to get the shifts off, going forward, going on to the next gear and getting you going fast. Pretty impressed actually with this car's acceleration capabilities, even though its steering precision and steering feel is definitely not where I feel like it ought to be for a car that was intended to compete where this car was intending to compete. And for that reason, this car ends up being a little bit of a mixed bag. From a luxury perspective, the interior is okay. It's not amazing, but to be fair, even if you get into an E63 from this era or an M5, those interiors weren't that great either. This is still lagging behind them, but it was also a less expensive car, and the interiors from this era in general were never great. Audi probably had the best, and by modern standards looking back, even those weren't that incredible. And this car is aged also. Like, stuff isn't quite as tight as it was when it was new. Like, it feels like an older car made a little bit more cheaply than some of those German cars that I think age a little bit well with higher quality materials. But it's a performance bargain. It's a fairly reliable car. It's a roomy car. It's decently luxurious, just not amazing. There's a lot of great stuff about this car, especially at the price point where they trade now, and you get a pretty powerful, pretty sporty vehicle out of the whole experience in kind of a cool way. So I always have liked these cars. I've always been curious about them, always been interested in how they drive. The answer is they drive pretty well. They're pretty fast. They're not the best dynamically, but for the money and for what they are, they were okay. Definitely not on the level of an M5 in terms of an overall package, but for a cheaper, value-minded customer looking for maybe features and instead of dynamics, there's something to be said about this car. And even today, it still feels pretty quick and pretty performance-y and wonderfully subtle and under the radar. And so that's the 2006 Cadillac STS-V, the American performance luxury muscle sedan. This car isn't dynamically a BMW M5, and it's not as exciting as a Mercedes AMG E-Class, but it does have some big power and some other cool goodies, and you can buy this one on Cars and Bids. Anyway, now it's time to give the STS-V a DougScore. And the DougScore is here, 49 out of 100, which puts the STS-V here in this group last among its closest competitors. That makes sense as the STS-V never quite succeeded in its mission. It doesn't drive as well as rivals, and although it's certainly cheaper, it feels even cheaper than it should given the price delta between the Cadillac and its European compatriots. The STS-V is good, but I really wanted it to be great. It would take a few more years before Cadillac could really create a world beater in the form of the CT5V Blackwing.